The Soul of America After Trump. This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Dr. Bandy Lee, Assistant Clinical Professor in Law and Psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine, worked in several maximum security prisons, co-founded Yale's Violence and Health Study Group, leads a violence prevention collaborators group for the World Health Organization, WHO. Bandy is the editor of the bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president, for which she was a guest on this show a couple of times. And her latest Trump book, Trump's Mind, America's Soul, Profile of a Nation, where she moves from the psychosis of one man to the psychosis of a nation. Welcome back, Bandy. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back.
Okay, we got to start off with, I think we had you on 5 years ago, and you had all these predictions that me, even a Trump hater that I am, admittedly, thought were nuts. You know, that Trump looked sane compared to what you were saying could happen. I mean, talking about the potential for violence and things like that.
Right.
That he could take us into war, which he actually hadn't. So I was going back through my original notes and yours from the book, the new book, that you had some inkling about him from women friends of yours, and you kind of felt he was odious but not dangerous. And you had no interest in politics prior to this. We should say this. You had no agenda to get in the middle of this or to go after Trump. So how did this happen that you've been so accurate?
Yes, so I never saw this as a political situation. I saw that it was an extraordinary, exceptional situation where there was something that mental health professionals deal with, mental pathology, in such an important office, and that this was extremely worrisome. And I know that as a psychiatrist with 20 years of experience, I would see things that are different from the general public. That was why I felt it was my duty to speak up.
Let me ask you, I think you told me this once. I don't know if you were from Korea or where you were, but you'd had experience with totalitarian regimes, which kind of informed you, right? Almost in a sense of paranoia.
Oh, well, not myself. My parents, of course, were
Yes, yeah.
from Korea, and even though it was the South, there were authoritarian elements to it compared to the US. And my primary experience comes from teaching law students for 15 years. At Yale Law School, I co-taught an immigration legal services course where students would represent political asylum seekers from all over the world. And so I was actually very familiar with authoritarian governments and what they could potentially do to their citizens. In fact, it's very widespread.
You had been sort of threatened, I think, when this first started off. And I was wondering if you'd go through some of those stresses. And do you feel let down by the American Psychiatric Association and the whole Goldwater rule kind of ruse to try to get you off the road?
Yes, it was very alarming that happened. I was expecting threats from Trump supporters, given that he himself was violence prone. He exhibited exactly the characteristics of the violent offenders I treat. And in fact, I often have to refer back to gang members and gang leaders that I have dealt with in prisons in order to understand him. And that was exactly what caused me to believe that he was dangerous. Somewhere towards the end of his campaign, I got a chance to see him with his supporters. And that's when I realized he was not just the odious and probably, criminal person that he was in New York City real estate.
Criminal.
Well, in terms of not paying his workers and
taxes,
bankruptcy schemes and things of that sort. In terms of the American Psychiatric Association, that was really the alarming factor that got me speaking up in ways I never thought I would be. Because in March of 2017, as you know, the American Psychiatric Association changed its Goldwater rule to a gag order without exception and went on public campaigns to silence all mental health experts instead of going through the legitimate procedures of ethical committee investigations if members were to violate the rule. It only applies to members, not It's not part of any state licensing board because it conflicts with the First Amendment. Also, no other mental health association has the rule. So it's only 6% of practicing mental health professionals who that rule applies to. And I'm no longer a member since a while back. I resigned when their pharmaceutical industry connections were exposed. And so yes, they were getting a third of their funding from pharmaceutical companies, and that was objectionable.
So they stayed silent. They stayed silent on the opioid epidemic, then, right?
Not only that, they used to advocate for patient rights, but then they dramatically shifted their stance to supporting drug treatment, even at the expense of patients. And I couldn't stand for that at the time, but little did I know that they would soon be doing the same for federal funding. A couple investigative articles came out showing that the American Psychiatric Association received a few windfalls of federal funding since their intervention to silence mental health experts. And just to say that they never did this legitimately. They did it through public campaigns, spreading misinformation. And there was no actual disciplinary action against any members who broke the rule. And a couple past APA presidents who broke the rule in ways that would favor the president were not even spoken about.
And you lost weight and everything because you were attacked by a lot of Trump supporters as well. And with that question as well, did Yale Law School become hostile to you at all?
Well, in fact, they stopped referring cases to me since the beginning of 2020, when Alan Dershowitz actually made a complaint against me. So Yale Law School quickly responded and stopped referring any more cases, including one I was in the middle of. And then Yale Medical School also followed suit and held a meeting about me. And there's going to be a First Amendment issue about that as well. But that was only the beginning. What I expected would happen if the American Psychiatric Association intervened in ways that were not science or evolving practice-based, but was timed in a way for political convenience, that it was essentially the beginning of authoritarianism, in my view, when a professional organization ceded its authority, its profession's authority to power. And I predicted at the time, in fact, at the same time as predicting Donald Trump's dangers, I predicted that the American Psychiatric Association behaving in this way would completely disable the American public from responding to the number one national emergency, which I believed at the time was the president's mental unfitness.
Let me ask you, so absent the pandemic mismanagement, I believe he would have been reelected. As you predicted this, as we get to the end, did anything surprise you, the insurrection? And why would he have mismanaged the pandemic so badly?
Yes, tragically, nothing has surprised me. What has very unfortunately unfolded was what I anticipated would happen were there to be no intervention. And we had that situation of no intervention and everything unfolding as we predicted. And in mental health situations, we rarely get these opportunities where we get to see our predictions exactly unfold, because usually there is an intervention. Why he mismanaged the pandemic? Well, we stated in our mental capacity evaluation when the Mueller report came out, it may not have been enough to indict a president, but it was certainly enough, the highest quality information one could have for mental capacity evaluation, which is basic for fitness. And he failed every criterion. He showed that he would drastically mismanage any crisis, that there was no chance he would even allow it to be managed properly. And so when we first heard about the coronavirus, I stated starting in late January that we were going to see a death toll that would depend more on the president's state of mind than on the characteristics of the virus. And by March, we issued, the World Mental Health Coalition and I issued a prescription for survival, stating that he needed to be removed from office, or at least removed from influence, for us to avoid an unacceptable death toll. And of course, that didn't happen. Not even his influence was removed. And through all the propaganda, the pandemic was politicized. And we have the catastrophe that we have. Even before that, we do not know if we would even have a pandemic had he not dismantled the pandemic preparedness systems out of pathological envy of his predecessor. And
all right,
that's
a good place to break it. We'll be right back with Bandy. Stay with us. We're back with Bandy Lee. Her new book is Trump's Mind, American Soul, Profile of a Nation. The insurrection, was that directly related to the violence inherent that you thought would come out of Trump?
Yes, there were signs of violence from the start. Most people are surprised at the insurrection alone, but that was long in coming. And everything was obvious, from his violent policies of traumatizing little children at the border, to his human rights abuses, against immigrants and people who are different, his stoking of white supremacist terrorism in ways that the country has never seen before, and the escalating epidemics of violence, mass murders, and suicides were present long before the insurrection and his mismanagement of the pandemic. So it's really not any different, but violent episodes are usually arising out of circumstance. And I stated that the period after his loss of the election would be the most dangerous of this presidency. And
by the way, that was another amazing prediction that you made. The lame duck period would be the most risky period. And I don't think there's a person in the country that thought that. I started to get paranoid when he didn't admit he lost. And I got a nervous feeling about January 6th, but I never had any insurrection idea. Why exactly did you feel the lame duck period was so risky? Just because he lost?
Because he could not accept a loss. That would be equivalent to psychic death for him. That's even worse than physical death. And he would essentially do anything, destroy the country, destroy the world if he could, and retain the presidency. And we know now that he almost did that.
Bandy, let me ask you right then. So does he believe that the election was stolen, as opposed to all the cynical stuff where he knows he's BSing people? Does he believe he won?
I believe he does, but only because of this, because he started out misleading, because he cannot tolerate the thought that he lost. And he started with a pernicious lie, but just like the pandemic, which he recognized was serious and harmful, he told Bob Woodward that, and yet he proceeded as if the pandemic were a hoax. I think in the end, he convinces himself of that, and it does turn into a delusion because of his the fragility of his mindset. And we can also tell from the fact that his fixed false beliefs spread so rapidly and easily, and that is usually a characteristic of delusions.
Let me ask you this too. You had actually, you say in this new book, 2 White House officials contacted you back, I think, earlier in the administration. You obviously are not going to identify them. What were they worried about?
I actually did not ask for their identity. I was hoping at some point they would come forth again, but they have not. That was back when, that was at the start of the presidency, when people were suddenly alarmed by his chaotic and unstable style in the White House. And so when I was contacted by those 2 officials, one after another, I referred them to the emergency room, hoping that I would get another colleague who would also speak about this. And I wished to preserve at that time, I thought, my educational role for the public was more important than a treatment role, a direct treatment role with confidentiality restrictions. I mean, the Goldwater rule is not a confidentiality restriction, but a patient relationship would be. And so I was worried I would be bound by that, and thought that my ability to educate the public would be more important. Little did I know that by the time we rose the issue to the number one topic of national conversation, that the APA would step in ways that would black us out completely from the major media permanently.
What were they worried about? That he was becoming unhinged, or what?
Yes, that he was frightening them with his behavior. And
did you get a sense that these were rather high level or not? You have no idea.
I did, just from the manner with which they spoke. They were extraordinarily genteel. They respected me highly, as they had heard about the book that I edited, and they were taking it seriously, and as I thought, in a way that very high level responsible officials would, which is why I thought that going through official professional channels would be advisable. But unfortunately, the emergency doctor at the time at George Washington University Hospital was rather odd, because when I called to find out what happened, he just simply laughed me off.
Wow. Now, do we give Trump credit for this, or does this go against your prediction? He got us into no wars. He kept trying to extricate us rather clumsily. But, Bush and Obama had us in basically constant war for 20 years. Do you give credit to Trump for that?
Well, that's only the difference between strategic war making and pathological warmongering, which he has done. He has gotten us closer to war on many continents in ways that we have not seen in recent years. And in fact, the world is imperiled. He also renewed the nuclear arms race and made us much more susceptible to nuclear war around the world, as well as traditional war. I would not say that that's in any way stabilizing the world that would get us away from war at all. And his rhetoric shouldn't fool us.
Malignant narcissism is what you felt was underlying this. And when you first told me that Hitler had this, I had a real hard time linking, Hitler to Trump. But, and since then I've studied some of Hitler's playbook, and, the big lie, the big rallies, delegitimize the media, find an enemy. Do you draw this direct link?
Not really. They have as many differences as similarities, but there are marked similarities, because they might be extremely different in style. I often emphasize how much more disciplined and Hitler was a reader and a studier and a planner, and Donald Trump is the opposite of that. But you can see how similar pathology manifests the same across vastly different individuals. And I believe I've often defined fascism as mental pathology in politics rather than an ideology. And I think that's important to note, because we've so much considered this more in terms of Germans, the Japanese, Americans, and so on, whereas we ought to recognize that this is a common pathology that mental health professionals see routinely. It occurs in 1% to 5% of our population, and that we need to guard against these individuals gaining power. The end result is usually the same, no matter what system they gain power of.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll be back with our final segment. All right, I'm going to move soon to the profile of Trump supporters, which is key. I'll be right up. Bandy Lee, we're assessing the impact of the Trump presidency on the nation. But one more thing, in your book, you talked to the new book, Mary Trump, Michael Cohen, and Tony Schwartz, who wrote, of course, The Art of the Deal. what did you ascertain from then?
So I included that as collateral information because I viewed my role as to provide a comprehensive profile. The media were continually interviewing Mary Trump and Tony Schwartz, for example, and Michael Cohen for their direct experience, but that's not a complete analysis. And in fact, they bring their own drawbacks from being personally involved with Donald Trump. And so what I did was a profile that would be the kind that the CIA might request, that that I was doing as service to the public, given some techniques that I picked up from the foremost CIA profiler, who was a good friend of mine, who just recently passed, Dr. Gerald Post.
Yes.
Yes, so we were in close communication, and I learned a lot of techniques from him, as well as his own analysis. And much of that went into that, as well as my own background in public health.
What did Dr. Post think of Trump in a couple sentences? Had he looked at him?
Well, he did an analysis of him for the second edition of our book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. And then that became an independent book of his own, Dangerous Charisma, Donald Trump and his supporters. And he named it kind of after our book of The Dangerous Case. So we were very closely interacting at the time. And I do recommend his book, by the way. So he gave me a great deal of the political psychology perspective and looking at how pathological personalities manifest in leadership. For example, the narcissistic symbiosis that I describe in my book, Profile of a Nation, derives from his conceptualization of how narcissistic pathology manifests when it shows up in the arrangement of leader and follower. In other words, they fit together like lock and key, are almost inseparable, and they form a tight emotional bond that becomes a conduit to what I have been calling shared psychosis, which is the transmission of symptoms. When you have a highly symptomatic person in an influential office with a lot of exposure to the public, then even healthy individuals will come to take on his symptoms.
That's a great segue to where I'm going. We go looking at the profile of the Trump supporters now. 60% of the Republicans still believe the election was stolen, even though there's no possible way. And his base of 40% supports him if he shot somebody.
Not only that, they will support him to their deaths, and they are, even as they're
why is that? I don't,
Yes, that is the power of the mind and the power of pathology to redirect even the most rational goals and override them. And that's just how powerful the mind is. So persons like Donald Trump have figured out that they don't need any policy, they don't need any skills or even talent other than using their symptoms to beguile and bring on board a vast portion of the population. They do this almost automatically for the sake of the adulation and adoration that they emotionally crave for, to compensate and overcompensate for their feelings of inferiority and lack of self-worth that comes again from the narcissistic developmental wound. But in order to obtain the adulation, he projects himself as a grandiose figure who can fix everything, and only he can be their leader and protector. And that is very attractive to those who are also narcissistically wounded and looking for a parent figure. So they come to identify with him, and his success is their success, even if they were to die for his success.
And this sounds also like what essentially makes a con man successful. Is this a talent for politics, even though he was never in it, that is just basically amazing, or it's just pathology? He doesn't even know how it's happening.
It's pathology. A lot of people viewed it as brilliant strategy and how he is talented in this. I mean, he's grown in skill because this is all that he has invested in and focused on, so much so that he has very little or skill elsewhere because this is what he has cultivated over time. This is what we normally see in a lot of actually criminal minds that I have treated as my career's specialty in jails and prisons, since I specialize in treating violent offenders who mostly turn out to be pathologically narcissistic or sociopathic.
Is this a cult?
Depends on what your definition of a cult is. It has many characteristics of a cult. So when people think about cults, they are enclosed, kind of forced situations where people are isolated from access to the outside world, and then they are indoctrinated. A cult was created in a sense that people are isolated now as a result of psychological conditioning. They are not blocked from outside information, but they are conditioned to reject any real sources of news and to see real news as the enemy of people, and to accept only the indoctrination that they are told is real news. And so the difference is that unlike the usual cult setting where physical barriers keep people thinking alike, we have people who are part of this, part of cult-like thinking, but also in the same families, neighborhoods, and communities as those who are not indoctrinated.
You're an expert in gender violence. Is this similar conceptually to battered spouse, whether it's male or female, that these his supporters?
Well, I have used that in the context of how we have dealt with this president. Why is, the most criminal and destructive president that we have ever seen, and also mentally unfit president we have seen, has not been held accountable. And we have, even though he is perhaps the greatest white supremacist terrorist inciter in the nation, we have been reticent about calling him a racist. Even though he is a pathological liar, we have not even called out his falsehoods as lies. And the reporters have a visibly difficult time confronting him. And he has attacked female reporters or female lawmakers specifically, which speaks to, which pretty much gives away his fragile psychology, which is the basis for violence. It's not strong individuals who react violently. It's those who are ordinarily what we call cowards, who in effect are almost accidentally fall into violent episodes, as we saw from the incitement of the insurrection, which happens when he sees it as a life and death issue.
Let me ask you this, because you mentioned it briefly, accountability. It seems to me he's never been held accountable his entire life. He's bailed out in business. He crosses all kinds of legal lines, and then right up until he left office. How has he escaped accountability his entire life?
There are actually many individuals like this in society, and
really?
I fear that this is even growing to be a much bigger problem. When I started out working with violent offenders 20 years ago, they were mostly confined to jails and prisons, and very few were out in society. But later, toward later years, more recently, I noticed that more and more CEOs or leaders were exhibiting the characteristics of violent offenders, whereas, because of mass incarceration and a lot of normal people getting into jails and prisons, it's not so much a problem in correctional settings anymore, surprisingly. But it's the same personality. What's different is that instead of the socioeconomically deprived situations my patient base is born into. These individuals are born into conditions of wealth and protection from the law. And we now know that the law is applied extraordinarily unjustly and unequally. I've always called it the criminal injustice system, but I simply did not imagine to what degree some people were above the law. So it happens through psychological manipulation, intimidation, threats. We saw how the Senate conviction, even having witnesses, was avoided through threats.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll be back with our final segment with Bandy, the soul of a nation, coming right up. Bandy Lee, we're assessing the impact of the Trump presidency on the nation. Is the nation mentally ill, and how do we go about deprogramming and getting us back on track? Is it possible?
Yes, it's certainly possible. The reason why I've been speaking up all this time is because I see a path to prevention and treatment where things have already gotten bad. But now we have just bred the problem to the maximum emergency. But still, there are, of course, all I can see is treatment methods in front of me all the time, and yet society is not taking it on. Is society sick? I think we need to recognize the fact that there are sick societies and healthy societies. And sick societies, interestingly, take on the same characteristics that a sick individual would. So what we're dealing with right now is more so than a bunch of sick individuals. What we're dealing with is a sick society where individuals are caught in it. I've said from the beginning that Donald Trump, when we were putting out The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, that the book itself was not about him as an individual, but he was a barometer of the state of societal mental health. And but once he was in office, he would accelerate and exacerbate its problems. And this is where we are right now, where we're seeing the result of 4 years of unmitigated pathologizing, pathology spreading influence that he has had on the population. And so I recommend 3 steps in the book, as you probably have read. The first step is removal of the offending agent, which is the person with severe symptoms in an influential position. We remove him from the position as well as influence. Right now, he's been removed from the position, but not from influence. He has not been discredited. He has not met any kind of reckoning or prosecution or conviction. The impeachment does not help because we know from the past when he's acquitted, he takes it to mean that he's innocent of all charges and even goes after in revenge those who tried to charge him. And so we need to remove his influence. Secondly, we need to dismantle much of the cultic programming that you were describing, that the propaganda outlets and right-wing media serve very much. The disinformation channels serve as cultic indoctrination in ways that are nationwide. The fact that it's happening at national scale should not deter us from thinking of this very much like a cult. So that's truly an emergency situation where cognitively people need to be deprogrammed through simply by eliminating fake news. People will revert back to, at least to a certain degree, of being able to take in valid information from there on. They may not be able to fix past indoctrinated beliefs, but at least in the future. And thirdly, we need to fix the socioeconomic conditions that brought us here in the first place. We don't think of socioeconomics as being related to psychology, but there is extraordinary psychological injury that happens from relative, not absolute, deprivation. So relative deprivation creates a hierarchy of those who are superior and inferior, and those who are the vast majority who are in the inferior position, the 99%, will be drawn further toward other sources of self-esteem, including white supremacy and sexism and all kinds of other nativism. other means of dividing the population and putting themselves at the top because they feel so awful from the conditions they were put in. So
that's funny, because that's why I think Hillary Clinton lost, was Trump felt the disenfranchised nature of the country that she was out of touch with. Now, the Fox, Roger Ailes, Rush Limbaugh, this disinformation, social media, whose algorithms drive polarization, you've identified that, but how is that fixable?
I think a lot of that, the disinformation system, I think one part of it is the deregulation of the media. I don't believe that disinformation should ever be allowed to be called news. In fact, I'd worried about this since about at least 25 years ago, that this would have serious consequences for the nation's mental health. And in fact, in some ways, I predicted what would happen to the nation back then. So that needs to stop. The social media algorithms also drive people to extremization and conspiracy theories, and that's also another automatic formula for driving people toward certain doctrines. And we need to look at the mental health effects of all these arrangements, because they are affecting the health of the nation at wide scale, which is why I have said that mental health professionals do need to speak up, and that what the American Psychiatric Association did to relegate mental health to be the only field from which the public could not speak about, could not hear from experts about, was going to have serious consequences. In fact, the most dire consequences. The entire public health problem of the pandemic, the presidency, the violent insurrections, all could be traced back to, in my view, to the APA's actions and what they did from behind the scenes.
So right now, Trump's influence, as you mentioned, has not degraded in any way or been discredited. Right now, he could get the nomination for the Republican Party for 2024 if he wants it. Are we destined to have the same cycle?
I think we're destined to have a worse cycle if we allowed things to go as they are. I mean, he is driving himself. He declared once again, and I believe he's speaking this weekend. He's going to keep trying, and he won't stop. Without external limit setting, these individuals don't ever stop on their own.
In the last couple of minutes, do you believe there need to be standards? We've talked about it before, to prevent these, to uncover if someone's unfit before he runs.
Yes, in fact, the World Mental Health Coalition and I are working on a Truth and Reconciliation Forum to look at, what went wrong during the last 4 years of the presidency in terms of mental health, how to keep out dangerous leaders, and how to heal the nation from here.
Thanks to Dr. Bandy Lee. Trump's Mind, America's Soul, the profile of a nation. And I assume she's going to continue to work on the investments needed to fix the soul of a sick nation. It's been Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Our podcasts are on jimcampbellradio.com. Thanks for joining us. We'll see everybody on the next edition of Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell.